It's 2 a.m. In the Bay of Bengal, a 300-meter oil tanker glides through black water, 2 million barrels of Iranian crude bound for China sleeping in its hull. The captain believes he has won. He is 6,000 kilometers from the Persian Gulf and is beyond every American warship on the map. Then, the sky opens. Helicopters, ropes, boots on steel. In under 90 seconds, the ship belongs to the United States Navy, and every refinery in China just lost a lifeline it cannot replace. This is the story of how the U.S. just did something unbelievable to Iran, and why it is China, not Tehran, that is suddenly powerless. The supertanker slicing through the water that night was the MT Tefani, 330 meters of dark steel, built in 2003, a very large crude carrier that had spent the past decade swapping flags the way a fugitive swaps passports Botswana, Cameroon, Tanzania, Palau, Panama. The Pentagon calls it stateless, which is another way of saying it belonged to nobody except the network of brokers who move Iranian oil to Chinese refineries. A month earlier, the Tifani had sailed from Dongjiakou, a port on China's east coast. It had crossed the Indian Ocean, slipped through the Strait of Hormuz before the American blockade fully tightened, and loaded roughly 2 million barrels of crude at Karg Island, the deep water terminal that handles up to 90% of Iran's oil exports. Its destination on paper was the Riau archipelago near Singapore. Its real destination was mainland China. By April 21st, the Tifani was moving at about 6 knots across the Bay of Bengal, riding low under the weight of its cargo. The captain had every reason to believe he was safe. He was thousands of kilometers east of the Strait of Hormuz, well past the ring of American destroyers patrolling the Gulf of Oman. The blockade, as far as he knew, ended where U.S. Central Command's map ended. He was in Indopakam's backyard now, and nobody had ever boarded a sanctioned Iranian oil tanker this far east before. Then, out of the sky, helicopters appeared. They had launched from the USS Lewis B. Puller, a Lewis B. Puller-class expeditionary sea base whose presence in the region had been carefully concealed. In the video the Pentagon released the next morning, you can see American forces fast roping onto the tanker's deck with terrifying precision, moving room by room through the superstructure, securing the bridge before the crew could react. Not a single shot was fired. The Tifani, sailing under the flag of a country it had never visited, was seized in international waters in a theater of operations where the ship's owners had been certain no American blockade could ever reach them. The message from the Department of War was immediate and chilling. International waters are not a refuge for sanctioned vessels, the statement read. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had warned a week earlier that enforcement would reach into the Pacific, but nobody in Beijing took him literally. Now they had to, because every barrel inside the Tifani's hull had been meant to feed Chinese refineries. What made the Tifani operation so terrifying for China was that it was not the first interdiction that week. It was the second, and the first one had already set the pattern. 48 hours earlier, a different drama had played out much closer to Iran's shores. The Iranian-flagged cargo ship MV Touska, nearly 270 meters long, was attempting to run the blockade into the port of Bandar Abbas. It had ignored warnings over the radio for 6 full hours. On the evening of April 19th, the guided missile destroyer USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class warship with hull number DDG-1111, finally ran out of patience. The order came down and the crew trained the ship's 5-inch 54 caliber Mark 45 naval gun directly onto the Touska's engine room. Several rounds were fired at point-blank range. The engines died. Smoke poured from the Iranian ship's control room. Within minutes, Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit boarded the crippled vessel and took control. This was the first time in the entire modern Iran crisis that an American warship had fired on a merchant ship, and what they discovered inside should have been the headline of the week in Beijing. U.S. Marines found thousands of containers loaded with dual-use chemicals compounds that intelligence officials said could be used in the manufacture of ballistic missile components. And where had those containers come from? The Touska had twice docked in Zhuhai, in southern China, in the weeks before the seizure. Listen that again. An Iranian ship caught running an American blockade carrying material that U.S. officials linked to ballistic missile production, and its last known ports were on the Chinese coast. Within 2 days of this discovery, the Tifani was hit in the Bay of Bengal. This was no coincidence. This was a system being revealed in real time, a deliberate, sequenced American campaign to expose and shut down the entire Iran to China maritime pipeline. And that is where the real story begins. Because what looks like a fight with Iran is actually something much larger. It is a calculated American maneuver aimed at the one thing Beijing has no way to defend. Here is the sentence nobody in Washington will say, but every oil trader in the world now understands. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz has almost nothing to do with Iran. The numbers explain everything. Before the war that began on February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz carried roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, about 20 million barrels a day. According to the Japanese financial firm Nomura, 38% of all the oil passing through the strait and 23% of the liquefied natural gas was bound for Chinese ports. That single waterway supplies about half of China's total seaborne oil supply, not a slice. Half. Iranian oil itself accounts for roughly 13% of China's seaborne crude imports, and according to the monitoring group United Against Nuclear Iran, Beijing has been buying 90 to 95% of everything Iran sells. Karg Island alone, the one island hit by U.S. airstrikes in March, handles 9 out of every 10 barrels Iran exports. So when the Pentagon shut down Karg's outbound traffic and threw a ring of destroyers around the Gulf, it did not actually injure Iran first. It injured the buyer. The financial damage is brutal. According to analysis published by Real Clear Defense, the blockade is costing Iran approximately $276 million a day in lost exports and another $150 million in blocked imports, roughly $13 billion a month. President Trump himself has boasted that the blockade is costing Tehran $500 million a day, while the United States loses nothing. But every one of those lost dollars was a dollar Beijing was supposed to receive fuel for. Iranian shipments to China that averaged about 1.5 million barrels per day have reportedly collapsed to around 1.22 million, and the drop is accelerating. The small Chinese coastal refineries known as teapot refineries, which buy most of the discounted Iranian crude, have already cut their purchases sharply because they cannot absorb the soaring prices or guarantee delivery. And this is where the genius of the American move becomes clear. Washington did not blockade China. It did not confront a single Chinese warship. It never fired at a Chinese flag. It simply cut the rope that was feeding Chinese industry and let the economics do the rest. Iran bleeds dollars. China loses fuel. The world watches, and the U.S. Navy doesn't even break a sweat. The beautiful part from Washington's perspective is that China cannot accuse America of attacking it, because on paper, none of this is about China at all. Step onto the deck of any Chinese shadow fleet tanker approaching the Gulf of Oman today, and the first thing you will see is the wall. Not a concrete wall, a steel wall, and it is the most sophisticated maritime blockade in modern history. At the center of the formation sits the USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carrier with the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Frankie Peterson Jr. riding shotgun. Record-setting supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford has been moved into the Red Sea to anchor the western flank. Around them, more than a dozen additional American warships are spread across the Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Gulf of Oman, supported by thousands of Marines and sailors, including the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit that seized the Touska and the Lewis B. Puller Expeditionary Sea Base that launched the Tifani raid. The sea is only half the story. Above the water, FA-18 Super Hornets scream off carrier decks for round-the-clock patrols. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft sweep the Gulf of Oman hour by hour, feeding a live picture of every surface contact back to command. At high altitude, MQ-4C Triton drones loiter for 30 hours at a time, their sensors able to detect a single fishing boat's heat signature from 60,000 feet. Satellites triangulate AIS transponder gaps. When a shadow fleet tanker goes dark, the system notices the silence itself. By April 20th, according to Lloyd's List and U.S. Central Command, 27 vessels had already been turned around or sent back to Iranian ports. Most never even got a chance to resist. The typical encounter plays out the same way every time. A tanker cuts its AIS and tries to slip through coastal waters. Within hours, an American destroyer appears on the horizon. A cold, polite radio voice reads out the ship's real name, its real owner, its cargo manifest, and tells the captain to reverse course. The bridge crew looks at the gray silhouette of a guided missile destroyer and makes the only rational choice. They turn around. Inside the Gulf, something close to paralysis has set in. Roughly 230 loaded oil tankers are now stuck in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. Karg Island storage tanks are filling toward dangerous pressure levels. Shabahar Port, which Chinese shipping has used as a back channel, is being watched by American destroyers that let nothing out. Bandar Abbas, Asaluye, and the quiet anchorages around Lavon and Iraq Islands have all gone still. This is not a blockade that can be slipped past with a clever flag change or a lucky night. This is a digital noose, and the tanker captains know it. So with its oil lifeline cut, its refineries hunting for barrels, and American Marines boarding ships in China's neighborhood, how has Beijing, owner of the world's largest navy by hull count, actually responded? It has sent diplomats. That's it. When the Touska was seized, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson described the Strait of Hormuz situation as sensitive and complex and called for dialogue. When the Tifani was boarded in the Bay of Bengal, essentially in China's own strategic maritime neighborhood, there was no naval deployment. There was a statement. Foreign Minister Wang Yi reportedly rushed to invite his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, to Beijing for an emergency meeting on energy, which tells you exactly where China believes its real options lie. The reason is brutally simple. The People's Liberation Army Navy is enormous in the Pacific, but the only permanent Chinese base in the broader Middle East is in Djibouti, and it holds only a handful of frigates and logistics vessels. Sending those ships to challenge an American carrier strike group in the Gulf would not be a deterrent. It would be indistinguishable from a suicide mission. And this is where the deepest strategic nightmare for Beijing comes alive. 20 years ago, then President Hu Jintao warned Chinese strategists of what he called the Malacca Dilemma, the scenario in which a hostile naval power cuts off the narrow shipping lanes through which most of China's energy must flow. For 2 decades, China built overland pipelines, bought African ports, and expanded its navy, all to escape that single vulnerability. And yet in April 2026, the Malacca Dilemma has arrived in a shape nobody expected, not through Malacca at all, but through Hormuz. The principle is the same. Whoever rules the choke points rules China's economy. And for the first time in living memory, America is proving exactly how fast it can close them. Inside China, the economic shockwaves are already rolling. Those independent teapot refineries in Shandong, the backbone of China's discount fuel economy, are cutting output as margins collapse. State refiners are drawing more heavily from strategic reserves, which, though massive at around 1 billion barrels, are not infinite. Beijing has prioritized stability over retaliation. Absorbing the blow quietly is safer than a military confrontation it cannot win. The image of China issuing strongly worded statements while American destroyers peel Chinese-bound tankers off the sea one by one is, for Beijing, a political humiliation that no state broadcaster can hide. Now flip the map around and look at what this same crisis is doing to the United States. Because the same blockade that has strangled Iran and embarrassed China has detonated a once-in-a-generation windfall for American energy. The mechanics are pure supply and demand. The moment the Strait of Hormuz began grinding to a halt, and the moment roughly 1/5 of the world's oil trade suddenly became unreliable, the global market began hunting frantically for replacement barrels. Crude prices spiked. Tankers that had been queuing for Gulf loadings diverted. The one region with the spare capacity, the modern export terminals, and the political stability to fill the gap was the American Gulf Coast. Along the Texas and Louisiana coastlines, the ports of Houston, Corpus Christi, and Beaumont have gone from busy to historic. According to industry reporting, more than 70 very large crude carriers were scheduled to call at American ports in April alone to load export cargoes, with similar traffic projected for May. Cranes are running around the clock. Pipeline terminals are operating near capacity. The strategic spillover is even more dramatic than the dollars. Nigerian, Colombian, and Venezuelan crude, after a separate American-led crackdown on Caracas that began in December 2025, are all increasingly flowing into refineries aligned with Washington. And in a move almost no one noticed at the time, the United States has just signed a defense cooperation agreement with Indonesia focused specifically on the Strait of Malacca, the very choke point Hu Jintao warned about in 2003. That is not a coincidence. That is a blueprint. Added up, and the picture is stunning. Within 60 days, a single American naval operation has accomplished what a decade of sanctions could not. It has priced Iran out of global markets. It has cut China's cheapest fuel source in half. It has funneled hundreds of millions of barrels of global demand toward American exporters. And it has positioned Washington as the only reliable energy power standing between the developed world and an oil crisis. This is why Trump's phrase, "the United States loses nothing," is not bravado, it is arithmetic. And now we come to the most cynical player on the board, because while Iran bleeds and China chokes, there is one country quietly making billions from the fire: Vladimir Putin's Russia. On paper, the Kremlin has condemned the blockade as piracy. The Russian Foreign Ministry has issued statements calling the U.S. operation a violation of international norms. And yet, behind the cameras, Putin has done something quite different. He has done nothing. The mathematics for Russia are almost obscenely favorable. Every time oil prices jump on a blockade headline, Russian producers sell the same barrels at higher prices. Russian crude to China, already flowing through the Espo pipeline and via Pacific ports, is now in surging demand as Chinese refiners scramble for substitutes for lost Iranian cargoes. Beijing's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has personally invited Sergei Lavrov to Beijing to negotiate expanded oil and gas supply, and analysts covering Russian energy flows have been tracking a sharp rise in Russian export revenue through April, a windfall of billions in additional income that flows straight into Moscow's war budget for Ukraine. In other words, the friend Iran most trusted has watched Tehran's oil empire collapse and found the whole thing quite profitable. The lesson, delivered ice cold by the Kremlin, is the oldest one in geopolitics. There are no permanent friends. There are no permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests. And in April 2026, Russia's interests pointed away from Iran and straight toward the northern pipelines that will now bind China even more tightly to Moscow's energy gravity. The deepest irony is that this is exactly what Washington wanted. A Beijing dependent on Russian energy is a Beijing with fewer options, narrower supply lines, and higher costs. The Hormuz blockade has not just cut off Iran. It has quietly rewritten the energy map of Asia in favor of the United States. And so we arrive at today. The 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran is set to expire at midnight. President Trump has told Bloomberg it is highly unlikely he will extend it. Vice President J.D. Vance is in Islamabad attempting to restart talks that Tehran may not even attend. And Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf has said flatly on state television it is impossible for others to pass through the Strait of Hormuz while we cannot. But the chessboard has already changed. When you control the choke points, you do not need to defeat an enemy in battle. You simply close the door they need to walk through. And that is exactly what the United States has done. First with the blockade at Hormuz, then with the Touska seizure in the Gulf of Oman, and now with the unbelievable Tifani raid in the Bay of Bengal. Iran is bleeding. Russia is profiting. America is exporting. And China, powerful, proud, unmatched at home, is quietly discovering that the most fragile thing in its empire is the ocean it does not control. If this breakdown helped you see the map the way Washington sees it, hit that like button, subscribe for deeper coverage as the ceasefire deadline passes, and drop your own take in the comments. Do you think Beijing can break out of the Malacca dilemma this time, or has America already won the next Cold War in silence? We'll see you in the next one.